Today we're going to be taking a look at the CryoCannon. This is Driller's second primary weapon. We're going to be going over the pros, the cons of this weapon, why you might want to take it, the different secondaries that you might want to pair with it, and builds for each of the overclocks. Let's hop right into the pros and cons of this weapon. The major pro of the CryoCannon is that it can freeze enemies. Freezing enemies is a really big deal because if you freeze flying enemies or small enemies, you will kill them instantly. That is really nice. And if you freeze certain structure enemies, like the breeders or the nexuses, and you kill them, then there won't be anything that spawns from them. On top of that, just like all of Driller's primary weapons, this one tends to not run through ammo very quick, which is quite good, and it's very good for crowd control. Major cons to this weapon are that it does have limited reach. This is not really the greatest if you have ranged enemies pretty frequently on a mission. That can be remedied with certain overclocks, but typically you're limited to either the 10 or 15 meters of reach that the CryoCannon actually has. Another con is that this one does have an overheat system similar to the minigun, so if you overheat it, you can't use it for a limited amount of time and you'll have to wait for the pressure to build back up on it. So let's go over a build for the vanilla CryoCannon, and then we'll talk about secondaries that pair really well with it. In tier 1, I tend to either go with the larger pressure chamber, meaning that I can shoot it more often, or I'll go with the faster turbine spin up. This makes it so I can shoot pretty much instantly, rather than have that half-second build up to the actual fire of the CryoCannon. You do have cold in this tier 2. The main reason why I usually don't take cold is because you have cold radiance in tier 5, and that is the fastest way to build up cold on enemies, and generally the best, at least towards smaller enemies like grunts and swarmers. This is also really good for any close range enemies like Praetorians or Oppressors. It's just not as good against ranged enemies, since they're going to be a little bit outside of reach, even though sometimes you can get right underneath a Mactera swarm and freeze them just thanks to that too. So depending on the cave layout, you may end up wanting to go with cold, and cold isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just potentially that you might not need it if you have cold radiance, which I'm going to be taking in tier 5. In tier 2, we have extra ammo, extra reach, or a faster repressurization delay. Generally, I'll go with extra ammo here. The CryoCannon doesn't run out of ammo super quick. You could go with the longer reach here too. That is pretty nice, going from 10 to 15 meters. It makes it really nice if you have Mactera on a mission with Mactera Plague, or if you get the new Duck and Cover mod, then that makes it so there's more ranged enemies, and longer reach is actually really nice. But ammo is a really good option too. In tier 3, both these options are pretty good. I tend to go with the improved pump to have a faster pressure gain rate. That means so when I take my finger off of the trigger, I will gain pressure back quicker, so I can get back to firing a whole lot more. I do like this, but if you want the increased flow rate to have increased DPS, you can absolutely do that too. It also freezes enemies, at least at a distance, slightly faster too. In tier 4, we either have damage, cold, or ammo. Usually I'll go with ammo here. Ammo is just really nice. You go up to 720 ammo in total with the CryoCannon. It takes you a very long time to run out with this. And the CryoCannon pairs incredibly well with various secondaries like the microwave gun to clear up crowds really well. And it also pairs incredibly well with your drills, especially if you combine it with Vampire, to where you can just keep drilling enemies and getting your health back. And then in tier 5, we either have Fragile or we have Cold Radiance. Typically I'll go with Cold Radiance because this is just the fastest way to freeze enemies. You just want to be standing around enemies really close to them so that the cold radiance triggers, and this builds up cold all around you within a 4-meter radius. This is really useful for the crowd control. It's really good for freezing enemies. Fragile isn't necessarily a bad option to be taking in tier 5, since it means that enemies can shatter and you can just kill them instantly. For the secondary weapons, all of them are actually pretty good. The Sabata can get increased damage, and it actually gives you a decent amount of long range, even though it's a little bit basic. You have the EPC, which has a lot of utility because you can mine with it, so that one is a decent option for a secondary as well. And then the one that I prefer to go with, at least with the CryoCannon, is the microwave gun. The microwave gun is really good for the crowd control, and it's very easy to use. And so long as you have the overheat / freeze in tier 5 for the microwave gun, you can proc thermal shock across multiple enemies. For me, I usually take this microwave build, so in this one I'm taking the increased ammo in tier 1 so I can just use it more often, the heat sink so I don't generate as much heat in tier 2, but all of them in tier 2 are pretty good. You got a temperature amplifier in tier 3. This can make it so that heat or cold jumps to multiple enemies, which can be really nice, especially with the microwave guns. Exothermic reactor to deal even more damage when those enemies do trigger that. Then in tier 4, it's your choice. Some people don't even take a tier 4. I think all those options are perfectly fine, whether you want a bigger AoE, smaller AoE, or if you just want no AoE and just don't have to worry about hitting your reload button. And then we have the exothermic reactor in tier 5. That'll make it so if an enemy's on fire, we can freeze it, and that'll trigger thermal shock, or vice versa. This deals really high damage because the thermal shock is pretty much true damage to that enemy. It'll just do a guaranteed amount of damage regardless of how much armor or where you hit them with the microwave gun. Microwave gun is also really good for clearing up some enemies at a distance. It's pretty good for clearing up web spitters, okay at clearing up acid spitters, and it's really good at clearing up jellyfish. Let's move on to the overclocks now. And our very first overclock is going to be the improved thermal efficiency. This is the clean overclock that increases your tank size by 25. It also makes so your pressure drop rate is better. And it is quite flexible, and I tend to build it like this. Since it is quite flexible, I don't really need the extra ammo in tier 2, and having the faster spin up in tier 1 is just a nice quality of life thing. You could of course go the same build that I ran for the non-overclocked build, and that would work perfectly fine. Just like a lot of clean overclocks, you can kind of build this however you'd like. So if you find a build that you really enjoy, feel free to take it. For me, it's the increased startup, longer range, better pressure, more ammo, and then cold radiance once again. This one also pairs incredibly well with any secondary, so you can pair it with whatever you'd like. For me, I decided to once again take the microwave gun, and for this, I took the mega power supply, which gives us an increased rate of fire and increased magazine size. However, our cooling rate is worse, and if we overheat the microwave gun, it takes an extra second. This isn't really that big of a deal because a lot of the time I'm just going to be freezing a bunch of enemies, then pulling out the wave cooker, dragging it right across them to deal damage to all of them, then swap back and forth. And if you're doing that pretty frequently, your weapons aren't likely going to overheat. Sometimes the microwave gun does for me at very long range when I'm just trying to pick off a bunch of web spitters or acid spitters. But aside from that, if I'm using it at close range, it's pretty easy to swap back and forth between the two, as well as you can throw in your throwing axes to get extra health if you have vampire, or use your drills to get vampire value as well. Next up is the newest overclock, which is called crystal nucleation. So this one's a balanced overclock that allows you to basically have sticky fuel like the flamethrower does. Technically, the CryoCannon always had sticky ice, but it never really lingered that long. Now this leaves ice crystals in the way that deal damage to enemies that walk across them. These crystals can be broken by melee, weirdly enough, so if you want to pickaxe them, you absolutely can, but these can also be broken if enemies walk across them, at least if they're larger enemies. It seems like swarmers have no effect on them. This all comes at the cost of less ammo though. This one I do build actually quite a bit differently than my other CryoCannons, and this is the build that I've kind of been enjoying with it, although I have swapped back and forth between this one and my regular build. So adding cold with this one actually does matter because that makes it so you apply more cold on your ice floor so that it's building up cold even more. You could also put damage in tier 4 on this, because the ice crystals actually do scale off of your damage too, so if you have that, you can deal even more damage. For this, I'm going to go with cold in tier 1 so that I can build up the cold faster. Tier 2, I'm going with extra ammo. Tier 3, a faster rate of fire just so that I can put out more cold. Tier 4, I'm going with also more cold so I can freeze things a little bit quicker. And then in Tier 5, I'm running Fragile. This is pretty much the only overclock that I actually run Fragile on because it kind of makes the best use of it. I still think that Cold Radiance is generally better in a lot of situations, and if I'm running that, then my build does swap over to something like this, so it does change a little bit, and this has more sustained fire on it, but it doesn't do as much damage if enemies are walking across the crystals. Both of them I find to be fine, it just depends on what you want. Do you want more DPS, or do you want more longevity in your CryoCannon? For me personally, at least on the mission that I took this on, I decided to go with Heavy Hitter with the EPC, which is a balanced overclock that gets you more damage with the EPC. And for this, I built Fire. Freezing enemies and then burning them this way used to be kind of the old way to induce thermal shock. If you want to do that more consistently, you probably want to go with the wave cooker. The microwave gun is a bit better for that, but this one is really good for picking off enemies at a distance, especially fighting turrets, which is what I was actually going on this mission, in which case it just let me pick off like the sniper turrets a whole lot faster. But if you don't like this and you wanted to go with the EPC mining build, you could absolutely do that with pretty much any of the other ones besides, I guess, this one and Overcharger aren't really the best for that. Up next, we have Ice Spear for the CryoCannon. This is another balanced overclock. And this one actually doesn't come with any sort of downside other than giving you an additional 1 second repressurization delay. So rather than having the 1 second delay, you have a 2 second delay now. The major upside to this one, though, is that now if you hit your reload button, this will fire out an Ice Spear. This does take time to charge up, but this Ice Spear does really high damage. It has very long range. It also flies incredibly straight. You don't really have to worry about drop-off with this one, and you can even pull off some shenanigans with this one, where you can actually one-shot the twins with it, which is kind of funny, at least if you have Blistering Necrosis and you put that on them, freeze them, and then shoot the Ice Spear into them. This also will overheat your gun when you do shoot that Ice Spear. However, you don't need to be at full charge in order to shoot this off, so a strategy that I like to do and quite a few other players like to do is use your CryoCannon as normal, freeze enemies, and then once the pressure is getting really about ready to overheat, then hit your reloads, then you fire out the Ice Spear, overheat it, and then you can swap to your secondary weapon. You don't have to do this every time that you're using the CryoCannon. It's probably best that you don't because the Ice Spear does consume 50 ammo every time you use this, so you want to be saving this for big enemies. and pretty much just big enemies. It works pretty well on Dreadnoughts, and it can work really well at like one-shotting menaces at a distance, so you do have a way to pick them off. The build that I'm going to be running for it is this one, which is my standard CryoCannon build. You definitely want to go with ammo in tiers 2 and 4, just so that you can use the Ice Spear a little bit more often, unless you're just keeping it as like a bulk detonator deleter or a warden deleter or something like that, in which case the other options are perfectly fine too. This one is similar to a lot of clean overclocks where it doesn't really come with that much of a downside. The only downside is if you do use the Ice Spear. So just use that when you need to, and you should be good to go. Secondaries are your choice. You can pick whatever you'd like. For me, I decided to go with the Explosive Reload Sabata. This one is a very strong build for the Sabata, probably one of its strongest, if not its strongest. And this one makes it so you put embedded detonators into enemies, and when you go to reload, those detonators are set off and do really high damage. Pairs really well with the CryoCannon. The way I like to build it is like this, so I'm going with extra magazine size, more ammo, faster reloads, more ammo, and blow through. You definitely want to go with more ammo for this one just so that you can use it more often, and damage is just not worth building for, because the ammo is going to get you more damage thanks to the explosions actually going off. Our next overclock is the balanced one, Tuned Cooler. Tuned Cooler gives you 1 more cold per particle, so you can freeze enemies faster, at least at a distance. This one also buffs your flow rate so that you do a little bit more DPS thanks to this. It does make it so you have a longer charge up time, and your pressure gain rate is worse. You can build this a couple different ways. You can build it for freezing at a distance, which I think is kind of the intention of it, but a lot of the time it's really not as good as just going with cold radiance. So typically just making up for its weaknesses works kind of the best for me, and then kind of finding a middle ground for longer reach, which is what this build is that I'm running. So in tier 1 I'm going with the faster spin up. Otherwise, this is a 0.7 second spin up, so it's about as long as the minigun, I believe, at least regularly non-modded, which is kind of slow for the CryoCannon. So dropping this down, it's a little bit quicker than what it would normally be, not as fast as it otherwise could be. And then we have increased reach in tier 2, just to kind of make use of that extra cold so that I can freeze enemies at a distance if I need to. The better pressure in tier 3, this one really helps with it, even though it's still not a huge bonus to it. Actually, it's no bonus at all, it's still a negative, but it does make it so that the gain rate is better than it was previously. More ammo in tier 4 because it's just super nice, and then cold radiance in tier 5. This one is kind of an awkward overclock. It used to be really strong at one point in time because it used to be a clean overclock that was just +1 cold, and it was pretty much the most picked overclock for the CryoCannon because it was so flexible. Now that it's a balanced overclock, it's not quite as good, and I think there are better ways to freeze enemies, but if you do want to take this, it can be useful in the Mactera Plague missions, and it can also be useful on the Duck and Cover missions. For a secondary weapon with this, I decided to take the EPC, and I took it with Persistent Plasma. This is a very strong overclock that basically comes with no downside. You do lose out on damage from the charge shots to shoot off with this, but then you get more damage if enemies stand inside of the charge shots, so you make up for it incredibly quick. It also slows enemies that walk into that, and it makes it so you can build this however you would like. I have it built for an EPC mining build. This one is pretty flexible, and it's usually my go-to for that sort of build. Ammo in tier 1, cooldown in tier 2, faster charge up in tier 3, although you could go with better ammo economy in tier 3 too if you're okay with the slower charge. I like the faster charge. More ammo in tier 4, and then thin containment filled in tier 5 so that I can actually EPC mine. In order to EPC mine, you have to do a charge shot and then fire a normal shot, or somebody needs to fire a normal shot and hit that. That will cause it to explode and deal damage to everything around it. This also breaks up the terrain. And then we move on to our final balanced overclock, which is flow rate expansion. And this one's kind of a weird one. This one increases your pressure gain rate, but it also increases your pressure drop rate. So you can overheat the weapon faster, but it does come up quicker so long as you're kind of feathering the gauge on it. That's kind of awkward. It does make it so it doesn't have the same timing or the same fill as the other CryoCannons. It's not a particularly bad overclock, it's just a different adjustment to the CryoCannon. The build I'm going to be running is the same as my normal CryoCannon build. This one is basically my vanilla CryoCannon, but it can just overheat a whole lot quicker, but it can also get that pressure rate back up a whole lot quicker. This can be particularly good against big enemies like bulk detonators and dreadnoughts because you can just freeze them so much, wait a second, and your pressure will come right back up and you can continue to freeze them. This does make it so you have to be paying more attention to your gauge, which is kind of difficult during a Dreadnought fight, at least it can be at times, but it makes it so you can have consistent freezing on enemies if you would like to go with that. For a secondary weapon, you can kind of take whatever you'd like, because this one doesn't necessarily nerf or buff your CryoCannon a whole lot. So for me, I decided to take automatic fire with the Sabata, and for this I built it like this. So increased accuracy in tier 1, more ammo, faster reloads, more weak spot damage and blow through rounds. This is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to be using this as a submachine gun at very close range, or even out to longer ranges. For our next overclock, we have Snowball. This is an unstable overclock for the CryoCannon, and this one's very similar to Ice Spear, where you can hit your reload button, and instead of shooting out an Ice Spear, you're going to fire out a Snowball, which is very similar to a Scout Cryo-nade. This has the same downside that Ice Spear does, but it comes with another downside of losing 100 ammo overall for your weapon. And whenever you want to use your Snowball, hit your reload button, this will fire it out, and this consumes 25 of your ammo. This Snowball will then hit an area. This is the same area that Cold Radiance actually triggers in, so it's 4 meters, and this will apply cold to all enemies that it's hit nearby. It also has lingering cold, so the cold will build up over time. But once you do shoot this, it does overheat your gun, so you're going to have to wait for the pressure to build back up in order to use it again. With the lingering ice that this one got, it is actually pretty good. It didn't always have that. It also used to consume more ammo, which wasn't really that great. It's also really good against Mactera plagues, because if you fire this in and hit one of the Mactera, you're probably going to freeze the entire plague and just kill them outright. It's really good in those rolls, but it does take out your ammo, so I would recommend this build, which is the same as my normal CryoCannon build, and I would really recommend ammo in tier 2 and tier 4, just because this one does nerf your ammo, and if you're going to be using the snowballs, you can eat through your ammo pretty fast. This also doesn't let you cheat out the snowball either. You have to have 25 ammo in order to shoot it out. For a secondary for this, I decided to go with energy rerouting, a clean overclock for the EPC, and this is a super flexible one. It just gives you more ammo and a faster charge up. You can build the EPC however you'd like. I built it like this, just straight 2 build. This one's for EPC mining, but you can also just use it for regular shots, and it actually does that really well too, so take whatever you'd like with this one. If you want it for single target damage and just regular shots, you can do that. If you want shard shot damage, you can do that as well. And then we move on to the final unstable overclock, which is Ice Storm. Ice Storm doubles your damage from the CryoCannon, as well as it doubles it again if the enemy is frozen, which is quite strong. You actually get 4 times the amount of damage when you're hitting enemies with this. But it does make it so your freezing is worse overall. It also makes it so you have worse pressure drop rate, so you can overheat your gun faster than you otherwise would. This one is actually quite strong, and this one I really enjoy. This is probably my favorite CryoCannon overclock, even though it's very straightforward. It's very nice. In tier 1, I'm going with a better pressure drop rate. This makes it so I'm not dropping as much pressure with this one, which is kind of useful. Extra ammo in tier 2, this actually puts us back to the normal amount of ammo. Better gain rate in tier 3, so I can use this more often. Damage in tier 4, this one's actually really good on this one because you're getting even more damage since it's multiplied so high. And then Cold Radiance in tier 5. Cold Radiance is the best way to freeze this, and just because your CryoCannon has worse freezing power, that doesn't mean Cold Radiance actually has worse freezing power. So if you just get up close and freeze enemies thanks to Cold Radiance, as well as some of the cold that you have on your CryoCannon, you'll actually be able to freeze them really quick, and then you can just hold this on the enemies and they'll die very fast. This is a really good weapon for killing Dreadnoughts. It can also be a really good weapon for killing any sort of big enemies, oppressors, Praetorians, menaces, anything like that. It actually kills very fast. The major downside to this one, though, is that you can run through ammo with it fairly fast since you don't have the most amount of ammo to begin with. For a secondary weapon, I decided to pair this with the Wave Cooker once again, and this time I paired it with Blistering Necrosis. Blistering Necrosis allows me to put blisters onto an enemy. Once those blisters pop, they deal extra damage to the enemy. This goes for anybody popping those blisters, so if you have a high damage weapon, like an M1000 or something, you can snipe those off and do really high damage, which is really nice. Blistering Necrosis is also great with the Boiler Array in Tier 5, which is the way that I take it, so that I can clear up smaller enemies. It actually procs pretty often towards smaller crowds, and you can usually just pop a bunch of jellyfish or pop a bunch of the little swarmers. There isn't any need to be taking the thermal reactor in this one, because we don't really need to overheat enemies once they're frozen. We kind of want to keep them frozen so that we get extra damage from the Ice Storm. And that'll do it for all of Driller's CryoCannon overclocks. Builds for each of them, and vanilla builds. CryoCannon is quite strong. It's a very good weapon. It kind of always has been. Very good in a team setting too, because it provides so much utility. Really, all of Driller's primary weapons do that. CryoCannon is something kind of special, especially paired with the drills. It works really well with them and the axes and vampire. If you guys would like to see another weapon in Deep Rock, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I am going to be going over all the primary weapons. Probably do a scout one next. I'm thinking the GK2. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye!